Call the committee to order. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here. A brief announcement that I've been asked to convey for anyone that might be in the room that might not know otherwise. The Foreign Affairs Asia Subcommittee hearing, Human Rights in South Asia, views from the State Department and the region, that hearing is occurring in 2318 Rayburn. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on how we can protect the Good Friday Agreement and uphold the peace and stability in Northern Ireland. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'll now make a brief opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. The focus of our hearing today is how we can help maintain peace and stability in Northern Ireland in the face of the United Kingdom's potentially imminent exit from the European Union. Brexit has been a long and challenging process full of difficult negotiations and, fair to say, a lot of twists and turns. Even as we sit here, a new proposal to address the issue of Northern Ireland is under consideration by the UK Parliament. For many of us, Northern Ireland is a deeply personal issue. My generation grew up bearing witness to the Troubles, during which 3,500 people approximately lost their lives. We mourned their loss. We celebrated alongside our compatriots when the Good Friday Agreement was reached in 1998. Now, 21 years later, the Good Friday Agreement remains invaluable to peace and stability on the island of Ireland. Special Envoy to the Northern Ireland, George Mitchell, played a crucial role as chairman of the peace talks, and the United States is still viewed as a neutral broker in maintaining good relations between the United Kingdom and Ireland. I would say every time I speak to some of my peers in Ireland, they will remind me time and time again that there would have been no peace if it had not been for the U.S. intervention. I'd like to recognize Chairman Neal of Massachusetts, Representative King of New York, who served as co-chairs of the Friend of Ireland caucus and have long committed to ensuring the success of the Good Friday Agreement. It's not to say the situation is perfect today, as Northern Ireland continues to deal with the past and the legacies of the Troubles. Most Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, while they largely coexist, still live separate from one another. Northern Ireland still struggles with governance and economic inequality. Pockets of parliamentary activity still exist. Just a few months ago, journalist Lyra McKee was shot by a new IRA dissident Republican group, yet due in large part to the Good Friday Agreement, these challenges are neither pervasive or insurmountable. Today, Brexit is poised to threaten those 21 years of relative calm. The Good Friday Agreement achieved the demilitarization of Northern Ireland with the removal of the security installations at the border, and the conflicts and violence that often accompany them are gone as well. After Brexit, Northern Ireland will be the only part of the UK that shares a land border with the EU, and many fear those border controls could once again result in a new reality. The return to a hard border would not only symbolize a divided Ireland, it would create enormous problems for the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland, who for the last 2 decades have been able to work, trade, and move freely across the border, a reality that's been fundamental to a lasting peace. It's no surprise that Northern Ireland remains a main sticking point in the negotiations between UK and the EU. This is not an issue that should be taken lightly. Nor should Brexit be permitted to threaten the decades of gains made under the Good Friday Agreement. I stand with Speaker Pelosi and other members of Congress, including Chairman Neal, in pledging not to engage in bilateral U.S.-UK trade deals should Brexit undermine the Good Friday Agreement, including the seamless border between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland. I'm pleased to join Representative Swazi King in co-sponsoring House Resolution 585, reaffirming the support of the Good Friday Agreement and other agreements geared at a lasting peace in Northern Ireland. As we know, the possibility of a Brexit deal is changing from moment to moment. That is one of the things that concerned us with this. We had to check in before the hearing started, just to be sure. And we're pleased that the UK and EU have attempted to make progress towards a deal and commend the commitment to honoring the Good Friday Agreement, particularly one that doesn't impose a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. We know that there are many details that still have to be addressed, and we know that everyone is not entirely happy with the potential deal. But we appreciate the commitment by the EU and UK government to peace for Northern Ireland and for the Good Friday Agreement. Regardless of what happens with this deal or any other developments that may transpire before October 31st, Brexit will not be an easy transition. It's still a long road ahead for the EU, the United Kingdom, and the island of Ireland as they deal with the reality of a post-Brexit world. And I hope their shared commitment to the Good Friday Agreement and peace in Northern Ireland will remain as the highest priority. I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining us today. I hope your testimony today will help us better understand Brexit's consequences for Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, and especially the deal that's being currently discussed. As members of Congress, we must continue to work towards a lasting peace, stability, and prosperity in Northern Ireland. Thank you, and I now turn it over to the ranking member for his opening remarks.
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. Very much appreciated. On June 23, 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the EU by a narrow margin of 52 to 48. This historic moment resulted in endless hours of debates, 2 prime ministers, resignations, snap elections, and a suspended parliament. It makes us look like we got it together here, so thank you. Now, after numerous failed attempts to pass withdrawal agreements through the House of Commons, we may finally be nearing the Brexit that millions of UK citizens voted for over 3 years ago. However, there's a lot of concerns. Many still worry about the possible unintended consequences of Brexit on the Good Friday Agreement, which ended the war in Ireland and brought peace to the island. During the 30 years known as the Troubles, roughly 3,600 men, women, and children were killed in Northern Ireland as feuding political factions terrorized one another. That's why I believe that any Brexit deal must protect the Good Friday Agreement and ensure that no hard border be constituted. Additionally, the agreement must protect Northern Ireland's economy. We cannot let unemployment drive a resurgence of terror on the Irish island. No one in the UK, nor in this room, wants to see the situation devolve to those darker days. Luckily, I don't think the Brexit deal struck by Prime Minister Johnson will result in that. Last week, negotiations for both the UK and EU came to an agreement on a Brexit deal that would honor the Good Friday Agreement. President Juncker of the European Commission has come out in support of this agreement, and it benefits both EU and the UK while lasting peace and stability on the while ensuring peace and stability on the island. Likewise, the EU's chief negotiator stated that this deal will avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, a key provision of the Good Friday Agreement, and would benefit businesses across the north. I'm thankful that the latest negotiated deal between the UK and EU emphasized the importance of this agreement. Whatever deal that's eventually voted on and enacted must avoid a return to violence of the late 20th century. Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was unable to pass this deal through the House of Commons over the weekend, has now asked the EU for a Brexit extension. In the meantime, the House of Commons is debating right now on whether or not to vote on the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement bill. If this is passed, they will have 3 days to consider this legislation. While passage of Brexit isn't guaranteed at this point, one thing I warn all of my colleagues to avoid is vowing to block any potential U.S.-UK bilateral trade deal. Not only is this dangerous message sent to the millions of British citizens who'd voted in favor of leave, but this mentality could also have unintended consequences on our own economy. Trade is good. Trade with one of our oldest allies is even better. A bilateral deal with the UK, should they eventually leave the EU, would benefit both economies and our constituents. I look forward to hearing from both of you today, and with that, I will yield back to the Chairman.
Well, thank you. And consistent with my opening statement, I'll note that the UK Parliament has just started voting on the second reading of the withdrawal agreement as we're here, hearing testimony right now. I'll call on Representative Cicilline for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Keating and Congressman Kinzinger, for holding this hearing today, which, as you just mentioned, couldn't be more timely on the subject of Brexit's impact on Northern Ireland. I appreciate especially the efforts of my good friend, the chair of our subcommittee, on the issue of Brexit's impact on the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Over the past 3 years, I've worked with him, Chairman Richie Neal, and many other members from both sides of the aisle to reinforce to our friends in the UK, Northern Ireland, and Ireland that any Brexit deal must preserve the Good Friday Agreement. Along with Chairman Keating, Chairman Neal, and our friend and colleague, Congressman Kennedy, We recently published an op-ed in the Boston Globe on the importance of a Brexit deal that maintains the Good Friday Agreement, and I would ask unanimous consent to have that placed in the record.
Objection? I hear none.
I was pleased to learn last week that the UK and the EU had reached an agreement, which is supported by the government of Ireland, that would preserve free movement of goods and people between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, as has so often been the case with Brexit, there appear to be some roadblocks to moving this forward. I very much look forward to the testimony today and to hearing how U.S. policymakers can continue to play a role in pushing for a resolution that will preserve this very important Good Friday Agreement. I thank our witnesses for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Dr. Amanda Sloat is a Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center of the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute. Dr. Sloat is also a fellow with the Project on Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center and Deputy Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. You'll notice when I say Harvard or Ireland, there's a little bit of an accent there. I apologize for that, but it's hard to control. We also have joining us Dr. Henry Farrell. He's a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He was previously a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars and assistant professor at the University of Toronto. We appreciate you being here today. It's a busy time, and I know your schedules were very challenging, and we'd like to call on you to give your opening statements, ask you to limit it to 5 minutes without objection. Your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I'll now go to Dr. Sloat for her statement. I think your microphone, is your microphone on?
Push the talk button. There we go. Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kinzinger, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to discuss the importance of protecting the Good Friday Agreement from Brexit. As a former HVAC staffer with Chairman Lantos, it's a pleasure to be on this side of the dais. Although Northern Ireland was rarely discussed during the 2016 Brexit referendum campaign, the challenge of addressing the region's unique status has become the biggest obstacle to finalizing the UK's withdrawal from the EU. Yet there have been insufficient consideration of how these contentious debates have already affected the region. I would like to submit my testimony for the record and will limit myself to a few brief points now. The April 1998 signing of the Good Friday Agreement enabled a comprehensive approach to governance and security in Northern Ireland. It took constitutional debates off the table. The UK government reduced its military presence and paramilitary groups decommissioned their weapons. An assembly with a power-sharing executive ensured both communities were represented in decision-making, and the EU membership of the UK and Ireland made the fragile peace more viable. The agreement did not fully resolve all tensions, but the region slowly began moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, Brexit debates have hindered this progress. Much of the debate, as all of you have noted, has focused on the economic implications of Brexit, including the need to protect the EU's single market while at the same time preventing the establishment of customs infrastructure on the Irish border. In my limited time, I want to highlight a few other consequences of these debates. One of the most tragic consequences of Brexit is that it has destabilized local politics by forcing people to choose sides between the British and the Irish governments. The clever compromise at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement enabled people to take a break from identity politics. Unionists remained part of the UK and felt reassured the province's status could only be changed at the ballot box, while nationalists felt Irish and had a greater say in local affairs. Brexit has brought back the old polarization, including questions about the region's constitutional future. On governance, Northern Ireland has been without a government since January 2017, actually breaking the Guinness World Records for the longest period without a government anywhere. The power-sharing executive collapsed over a domestic political dispute, while repeated efforts to restore the government have failed. Civil servants keep the light on, but they're reluctant to make politically sensitive decisions without ministerial oversight. The UK Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has nominal oversight, and Westminster has passed a budget to keep the region solvent. If there was a no-deal Brexit, civil servants in London have recommended reimposing direct rule to manage the consequences. There have also been concerns that Brexit could adversely affect numerous rights, including equality rights enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement, fundamental rights deriving from EU membership, and labor and employment rights deriving from EU law. The most prominent concern has been the handling of the agreement's provision that allows those born in Northern Ireland to hold British passports, Irish passports, or both. Finally, on the security front, it can be easy to forget that Northern Ireland remains a post-conflict society. Less than 7% of children attend integrated schools. Punishment beatings by paramilitary organizations increased 60% from 2013 to 2017, and there are more peace walls now than in 1998. There is continued instability, including the death of a journalist in April, as the chairman mentioned, and continued threats from dissident groups. Although people there don't expect a return to the large-scale violence we saw during the Troubles, police chiefs have warned that customs infrastructure could be attacked. Turning to U.S. engagement, for decades there's been a bipartisan consensus in Washington about the importance of promoting and preserving the peace process in Northern Ireland. This dates back to Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, who expressed support for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. In recent years, the U.S. administration has provided envoys to help facilitate the peace process. George Mitchell helped broker the Good Friday Agreement, Richard Haass helped save the agreement by pushing the IRA and decommissioning, and Gary Hart supported talks that prevented the collapse of the institutions. The Trump administration has declined to fill this position, with former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson informing Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Bob Corker that it was retired. Beyond benign neglect, the Trump administration has actively cheered for extremists in Britain who want a no-deal exit from the EU, no matter the cost to Northern Ireland. The president has encouraged the UK to abandon divorce talks with the EU, which he views as a foe, in favor of a trade deal with the US. Some congressional leaders, as has been noted, have already flagged the costs of a no-deal Brexit for Northern Ireland, including the Speaker and the co-chairs of the Friends of Ireland caucus. The U.S. could accept any Brexit agreement apart from no deal. In an ideal world, we would have helped facilitate dialogue among the parties as we have in the past. At this stage, interventions from the administration that champion one side to its own advantage are seen as disruptive rather than helpful. At a minimum, we should refrain from advocating a disastrous no-deal Brexit that the British government's own contingency plans show would have a significant negative effect. Peace should not be a partisan issue, nor should this be a zero-sum exercise in which political leaders feel compelled to back either the British government or the Irish government. As conflict rages across the globe, all sides should be united in protecting the hard-earned peace dividends of Northern Ireland.
Dr. Farrell.
Chairman Keating, Ranking Member Kinzinger, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. Like Dr. Sloat, I will confine myself to a few relatively brief points. First of all, it should be clear that Brexit was inevitably going to stress the Good Friday Agreement. The European Union had played a very important role in the lead-up to the Good Friday Agreement. It had first of all helped to drain some of the political tensions between the United Kingdom and Ireland when both were members. The tensions over the border issue and over territorial issues became less relevant. It created a context in which Northern Ireland politicians could come together in Brussels and in Strasbourg in order to try and fight for their constituents. And quite importantly, the fact that there was a customs union meant the abandonment of customs posts between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, hence making the border a less physically visceral thing. So when the Brexit problems began to emerge, there was a lot of fear, which continued onto the last couple of weeks, that we might see a no-deal Brexit. And if we saw no-deal Brexit, this would have had extraordinarily negative consequences for the peace in Northern Ireland. We would have seen the emergence of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which inevitably would have become a target for Republican dissidents and given them a cause to organise around. We also would have seen substantial economic hardship on both sides of the border, which would have in turn very likely generated political pressures that might have led to an increase in tension and perhaps helped push towards increased violence. And most importantly, perhaps, we would have seen a very undefined set of relations between the islands of the United Kingdom and Ireland, and between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which would have generated the sense that there were possibilities open there that were up for grabs, which are a variety of parties, some of them well-intentioned, some of them definitely less well-intentioned, might have sought to seize upon for their own particular purposes. So the belief that there was a high likelihood up until the last couple of weeks of a no-deal Brexit caused a lot of worry and fear and angst. The deal that we have at the moment that is currently being considered by the House of Commons, from the perspective of Northern Ireland peace, it is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it is far better than the alternative, which drew a lot of attention. So if we see what is happening in the deal, the two key arrangements from the perspective of peace in Northern Ireland are as follows. First, there is a very, very complex customs arrangement under which the Northern Ireland would still be nominally part of the United Kingdom from the perspective of doing international trade deals, but in practice would be effectively subcontracting out the administration of European Union customs arrangement within the Northern Ireland space. This would be extremely hard to administer. There are a lot of complex questions about how it will be administered, but it would at least mean that the key border would be a border between the island of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, rather than between the Republic and Northern Ireland, hence making it less likely that there's going to be things for Republican dissidents to organise around. And also there is an assent process by which the Northern Ireland Assembly as a whole, through a majority vote, or ideally through a vote of both communities, can effectively pass judgment upon the arrangement. So this is a lot better, but it is far from perfect. The Unionist community is extremely unhappy, especially the Democratic Unionist Party, which feels that it has been betrayed. And we see the possibility of stress on the institutions. As Dr. Sloat mentioned, the Assembly has effectively been out of action, as has been the government of Northern Ireland for the last 2 years. And bringing the Assembly together to vote upon this may create a set of future stress points which may be problematic. What the United States can do is what it has been continuing to do, at least on the House and the Senate side, which is to continue to express strong support for the peace process in Northern Ireland. The US role, as has been noted already, has been extremely positive, and there may be some scope for reaching out to and reassuring the Unionist community. Effectively, there's a lot of angst and tension in the Unionist community, and a lot of fears that they are going to be bumped into a united Ireland, that there is now a majority or close to a majority for support for United Ireland, and that the Republic of Ireland is looking to manoeuvre in order to make this happen. This is frankly not at all a likely prospect. The Republic of Ireland, if it has learned anything from the Brexit debacle, it is that having a narrow majority in a referendum is not a recipe for political stability, and hence the Republic of Ireland is not particularly interested in pushing forward towards any short-term destabilizing arrangements. And to the extent that the United States can help to reassure the Unionist community that the principle of consent of both communities is still important and is still the cornerstone of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, this would plausibly help perhaps to at least alleviate some of the tensions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is an unusual set of events. I'm now going to report that the vote passed 329 to 299 on the second reading to the withdrawal agreement bill, which means it'll advance for further consideration, and we'll learn shortly the results of the next vote on the timetable for consideration. Maybe this is hearing has helped. I doubt it. But I do want to just start asking a couple of questions, and I think Dr. Farrell really touched this, but if you both could maybe expand on it a little bit. And that's, regardless what agreements may or may not be made, the people of Northern Ireland voted not to leave the EU in the 2016 referendum, and many citizens and political leaders feel they haven't had a voice in the Brexit negotiations. So if you could, we see a lot of the officials moving, but what effect do you think, the sentiment behind that vote has on success perhaps going forward? Or it's very important what the people have felt themselves. And there are reports that many of those people feel left out of that process.
I thank you very much for the question, as well as for the play-by-play updates on what's happening in London. I would make two broad points. One, Brexit has certainly polarized politics across the UK. You're absolutely right that there was a majority in Northern Ireland that voted to remain in the European Union. It was the same in Scotland, the same in London. And so you've got a certain amount of unhappiness across the country at being forced to go along with something that they, within their nations and regions, did not necessarily support. The broader problem, I think, with people being left out of this is the fact that you haven't had a government sitting in Northern Ireland for almost 3 years. Northern Ireland certainly has elected representatives to the British Parliament. Sinn Féin, for historical, principled reasons of not supporting the recognizing the Queen or recognizing the British government, do not take up those seats in Westminster, which means that those from the nationalist community that voted for Sinn Féin do not have a voice in these debates. And you've had the Democratic Unionist Party playing almost an oversized role in these debates in London, given their role in supporting the Conservative government. So really, I think the biggest factor in excluding the voices of the people has been the lack of localized governance in Northern Ireland for so many years.
Just to reinforce what Dr. Sloat has said, the other question that I think maybe is not as clear from this side of the Atlantic is how much there is a set of pragmatic costs to the current situation, as well as the tensions between the two communities. So if, for example, one looks to the business community in Northern Ireland, if one looks to farmers in Northern Ireland, you'll see there that there is certainly there's been some concern about the bigger political consequences, but there also have been real fears about the ways in which the chaos and the tension and the possibility of a no deal might have led to economic crisis, might have led to supply chains between the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland being disrupted, might have led to what has become effectively a single integrated agricultural economy, suddenly finding that the crucial connections have been severed and trying to figure out how to reweave the threads. So there has also been a very pragmatic sense that a deal has to be done. And this also has consequences for the Democratic Unionist Party, many of whose supporters are probably a little bit more pragmatic than some of the leaders might suggest in their public comments.
You know, I've really been impressed talking to Ireland officials. You know, many of them just use the scenario that things have gone so smoothly generally with what's occurred in the border area that it's almost like starting from scratch. And they impressed on me how dealing with, as you said, Dr. the practical side of this, there's so many situations that aren't even anticipated. How long could this stretch out, even if there's a negotiation, even if things are worked out? This is extremely complex, and I don't think people here fully realize that.
For a very long time is the answer. So we have a transition period of another 2 years. We also have a lot of arrangements, and I should stress here, I am a political scientist, I am not a lawyer, but there are a lot of arrangements in the text which are going to be extremely difficult to work out in practice, and very, very complex arrangements, in particular around the application of customs, the application of value-added tax, to try and create this, to turn a complicated political fudge into something which business people can practically deal with in a daily sense. And so the political solution is extremely important for peace. The pragmatic consequences are going to take a lot of further work.
I would just add that even if we do get a deal in the near term, we really are only at the end of the beginning. We've essentially finalized the divorce. We now need to work out what the future relationship is going to look like. And there's lots of different permutations, some of which see the UK more closely aligned with the EU and others seeing it much further apart. And the reality of these provisions for Northern Ireland, as Dr. Farrell mentioned, is that the more closely aligned the UK stays with the EU, the less friction there is going to be on the border and the less separation from Northern Ireland with the rest of Great Britain. The more deviation, the easier it's going to be for the UK to negotiate free trade agreements with the United States and others, but then the greater challenges it has there. So it's going to be very difficult for the UK to have it both ways, and they're ultimately going to need to make a fundamental decision about how they want to align themselves, especially in regulatory terms.
I just remind everyone that 80% of our trade activity is with the EU in that regard, so it's something our country isn't going to take too lightly or in a bilateral sense. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Kinzinger, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, there's a lot we don't know, so I think you guys both did a great job of kind of explaining the situation and the difficulties and the unknowns, and we don't know till we know. So maybe the chairman will get us some more information in the next 12 seconds. Who knows? But I do want to ask on a couple of things, and I'll ask both of you. Talk about the lack of a government in Northern Ireland. Can you go into maybe some of the reasons of why? What are the disagreements? And also, has that been complicated by specifically because of this negotiation and because of Brexit? I'll start with whoever wants to go first.
The short answer is yes. So the Assembly initially collapsed over a domestic dispute. There were criticisms of the way a domestic green energy scheme had been handled, and so that was the thing that precipitated the initial crisis. The institutions have always been very precarious. There is narrow trust between the two parties, and so once the trust fell apart, it was very difficult to get it back together. You then started to have disputes over interest on the nationalist community in bringing an Irish Language Act into play in Northern Ireland, which was something that the unionist side had objected to. So that was the dispute on the ground. But certainly the broader tensions over Brexit ended up making politics there much more polarized and ended up increasing the difficulty of getting the Assembly stood back up.
Okay.
This is further likely to be magnified by the current arrangement under which the Assembly would have to be brought back in and would have to effectively vote upon whether or not it approves the current arrangement. So if you want to be optimistic, you could see this as being a possible reason and rationale to bang heads together and to get both sides to agree. If you want to be pessimistic, you could look at the stakes at play, at the way that the Democratic Unionist Party says that it has been betrayed, and you might see this as becoming yet another reason why it is difficult to get the Assembly back working and get back to a situation of normality or whatever approximates best to normality in Northern Ireland.
Dr. Sloat, you said you were talking about the unfilled envoy position. Dr. Farrell addressed Congress's role, but the United States played an important role in the peace talks in the Good Friday Agreement, ending the violent war. Can you tell me what we are doing now to preserve it, or are we just absent on it? I guess executive branch specifically, because Congress is, we're doing this.
Right. That would be an executive branch role, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the State Department. My understanding is that officials within the State Department have continued to have conversations with the British government, with the Irish government. Certainly at an official level, their policy is to continue to support the Good Friday Agreement and to have an agreement on a deal between both sides that preserves economic stability. But there certainly does not seem to be any effort, the way there have been in previous administrations of both political parties, to have a designated figure that essentially does a lot of shuttle diplomacy on the ground between the two governments as well as between the political parties in Northern Ireland itself.
Was your sense that they're just waiting until there's an agreement, or that that's just a lack of interest?
Well, what I have to go by is the letter that Secretary Tillerson provided to Chairman Corker, which made a case for saving the money that had been spent on the envoy and having that role fulfilled by the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs and the State Department instead, and also indicating that when the Assembly had been stood up, which was the point at which the letter had been submitted, the administration did not see a reason to have an envoy in place.
Okay. Dr. Farrell, we know that the installation of barriers along the Irish border could possibly lead to instability. In the event of a no-deal Brexit, which we obviously hope isn't the case, could an open border that deploys new technology be maintained?
So certainly there has been discussion of new technology. This was a major topic during the negotiations, where the United Kingdom effectively said that it should be possible with new technologies to create a seamless and invisible border. However, the United Kingdom never produced anything in the way of specific plans to show how this could be plausibly implemented, and hence the strong belief on the European Union negotiators' side, and also, I believe, among many political people in Ireland, was that this was effectively an effort to see if they could get a fudge created, which would not provide an actual border, but which would instead sort of provide a political deal, which would allow both sides to say that the problem had been resolved, even while the prospect of, of smuggling and other things across the border went more or less unacknowledged. And the European Union was particularly strongly against this because, as has been mentioned already, this is the only land border that would exist between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and hence they did not want this to be a source of significant economic abuse of the system. And the final thing that should be noted here is that there has been a lively underground economy on both sides of the border, which has sought to finesse various differences between regulation, for example, of gasoline for industrial uses. This has been one of the things that helped keep the troubles going for a long period of time, so that the issue of cross-border smuggling has security as well as economic consequences.
Thank you both. I'll yield back.
Latest news, the vote on the timetable has failed, so it looks like we may be waiting to hear from the EU on the extension. Chair recognizes Representative Cicilline. Good luck, Representative Cicilline, with that.
Our entire committee is in your debt for those updates, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Obviously, this cross-border cooperation is one of the most important parts of the Good Friday Agreement, and I wondered if you would speak for a moment about the potential reestablishment of border controls and whether or not in any important way that would undermine the Good Friday Agreement, and how, in particular, the populations that are living near the border are likely to respond to any additional border controls. Dr. Farrell?
At the moment, it appears under the current deal, if it does get through whatever hurdles, and I'm very grateful to be informed on a moment-by-moment basis, the current deal would not involve any formal border controls at all. The idea then would be that whatever border controls would exist in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, so that effectively there will be controls on material coming in and out. So the arrangements are extremely complex, but the idea is that there will be specific controls that would seek to ensure that material or goods which came into Northern Ireland and which were destined for elsewhere in the European Union would then be taxed at the relevant rates, and if you were importing something which had a tariff on it purely for use in Northern Ireland, you would be able to apply for a rebate of the tariff. Obviously, how this would work in practice is open to question. There are a lot of details to be ironed out, to put it mildly, but what it does do is to ensure that the risk of a physical border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, which could become a magnet for various forms of dissident activity, that this risk appears to have been avoided, assuming that the current deal actually goes through and sticks.
Dr. Slow, do you agree, assuming that that deal is approved and sticks and all of those logistics can be worked out, that none of the provisions will undermine the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, I think
there's a lot of conditionality, I reckon.
That is. Well, and to the chairman's update, the British Prime Minister had indicated that if this was the outcome, that he was likely to move to early elections. And an extension. So we will see how this plays out. I mean, but as to the question of whether or not infrastructure would be disruptive, it would be hugely disruptive. I mean, it would create practical and economic challenges. You have farms that literally straddle the border, and so what you do about sheep that are wandering across the border would be a problem. You have hundreds of crossings on the border, which would be extremely difficult to police. You have the psychological aspect of people that lived through decades of violence and saw in recent years these checkpoints coming down. And as Dr. Farrell said, the police in Northern Ireland have been very clear that any checkpoints would be a magnet for attack by dissidents. There does seem to be an indication that the mechanisms that have been developed in this protocol do eliminate the need to have physical checks on the border. However, there are concerns about the potential for a border in the Irish Sea and what this is going to mean for regulatory provisions in Northern Ireland to the extent to which the UK ends up deviating from the EU in some of these economic and regulatory terms. There's also broader questions about how political figures in Northern Ireland will be involved in various mechanisms that will be overseeing these new institutions that have been created. So I think if the deal goes forward with the current protocol, it will at least address the situation on the border, but there's still going to be a number of complexities that are going to have to be addressed.
And Dr. Sloat, you mentioned part of this outcome will be determined on the nature of the relationship between the UK and the EU. There are some who are suggesting that the United States should begin discussing a bilateral trade deal with the UK before a final Brexit deal is reached. Do you think that's a good idea? And what are the implications for Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Good Friday Agreements, if any?
Well, in technical terms, the UK is not going to be able to sign free trade agreements with third countries until it is fully out of the European Union. If this current deal goes through, there is currently expected to be a transition period. At the moment, that would run until December 2020. It's possible both sides could decide to agree that, or to extend that. So you currently could have talks starting on a free trade agreement, but the UK is not going to be able to sign anything until the divorce is completely final. I think the UK is also going to have to make some broader decisions about how it wants to align itself, because it's going to be very difficult for the UK to be aligned with both the US and the EU on things like agriculture, for example, on things like tech standards and data privacy. And so the challenge for Northern Ireland is that the further the UK deviates from EU standards, the greater the challenge that you're going to have with Northern Ireland being treated differently from the rest of Great Britain.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Pence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Kinzinger and Cicilline for asking my question. Thank you very much. That was perfect. My grandfather actually left during the Troubles because the North and the South couldn't get along back in 1921, I believe. So my heart is in Ireland, as are still many of my relatives. Thank you for being here today. Indiana Hoosiers conduct business all over the world, exporting products and services from the Hoosier state to everywhere. This includes the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland represents the Hoosier state's 8th and 14th largest export markets, respectively. United Kingdom and Ireland. Both of you make references to the effects Brexit more broadly and specifically the situation we are discussing here could have on trade relations with the United States. In your view, what is the ideal resolution given the votes and the things that are happening immediately today, changing situation, that could result in the best possibility of the U.S.-UK free trade agreement? And how can the United States be most supportive of this result right now, focusing on trade?
As Dr. Sloat says, there is a set of trade-offs here. If you are primarily concerned about peace in Northern Ireland, then the closer that the United Kingdom and the European Union are aligned with regard to regulation, with regard to a possible customs union, with regard to the kinds of machineries of the single market, this extraordinarily complicated set of regulations, the better. So these things, the closer that the United Kingdom and the European Union are, the better it is for peace in Northern Ireland. Obviously, that means that the closer that the EU and UK are, the more difficult it is to create a kind of a deal with the United States on many of the issues that the United States is concerned with. So that, I think, is an important trade-off that ought to be acknowledged.
I agree with all of that. I would just add that the worst outcome, I think, for the perspective of the peace process in Northern Ireland is for the UK to leave the European Union without a deal. I think while there are certainly trade-offs and complexities into the deal that's currently on the table, it at least would go some ways toward addressing the situation in Northern Ireland. What I think is particularly harmful is encouraging the UK to leave the EU with no deal and simply to walk away, because under those conditions, none of these provisions that we have been discussing would apply. And in theory, the British and Irish governments would need to reimpose border controls in the island of Ireland. That would be very damaging for all the reasons that we've been discussing. So certainly continuing to encourage the sides to reach an agreement and to have an orderly departure by the UK from the European Union would be the most satisfactory outcome.
And if I can just add on to what Dr. Sloat says, in that situation, it would be actually quite likely that the United Kingdom would find itself being forced to submit itself to many European Union regulations without very much voice in the process. So effectively, the UK and the European Union are already so closely and so tightly and intimately connected that it's going to be very, very hard for the United Kingdom to extract itself without a formal and orderly process of negotiation in a situation where the United Kingdom rockets out. The belief among many commentators is that the aftermath, the hangover, would be quite extreme for the United Kingdom, and that would effectively find itself having to accept as dictates from the European Union many of the things that it believes that it will be able to get away from.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Representative Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing. It's timely, obviously. Given the vote that was just announced today, do either of you care to speculate on what scenarios you think may now develop as a result of the loss of today's vote by Prime Minister?
So just to summarize briefly what it sounds like happened today and where that leaves us, Boris Johnson renegotiated the Brexit deal that his predecessor Theresa May had negotiated with the European Union, removing the backstop for Northern Ireland, which was very unpopular, and replacing it with this protocol for Ireland. Boris Johnson tried to bring that for a vote in Parliament on Saturday. Parliament made the decision not to vote on that and instead to introduce an amendment that would force the government to ask the EU for an extension and prevent there from being a no-deal outcome. So today, he ended up bringing the implementing legislation to a vote in Parliament. It was the second reading today, which it sounds like Parliament passed. It is then expected that it would open up a whole raft of amendments on things like a customs union and a referendum. The second vote was the program motion, which was essentially the timetable for passing this legislation. Members only got the 115-page bill yesterday. There's been a lot of concern that they haven't been able to scrutinize it. You wouldn't be able to have committee hearings. Boris Johnson wanted them to complete the process on the bill.
He was forcing the issue.
By Thursday, absolutely, because he wants to be able to say that the UK is leaving by the 31st. What he previously indicated was that if this program motion was not supported, his timetable was not supported, that would make it very difficult for him to leave on time, and he was likely to call for general elections. So if I had to predict what was going to happen, I suspect that we will now see the EU grant some sort of extension, potentially until the end of January, if not longer, and the UK will move to general elections, and this Brexit debate will get punted for longer.
You concur, Dr. Farrell?
I do, yes.
Well, and then obviously that potentially sets up a situation in which do you believe under any circumstances that a part of a call for new elections might include a new referendum on Brexit? I know that's been discussed by some.
The second referendum would entirely depend on who won the election. Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party do not support a second referendum. The Liberal Democrats have argued that if they are elected, they would revoke the Article 50 notification to leave the EU and not even have a second referendum. And the Labour Party has tended to prevaricate on this. Its leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has indicated that he would want to negotiate a better Brexit deal than Johnson's, and he would then bring that to a referendum where people could choose between his New Deal and staying in. So it really is going to depend on the outcome of the election, and you would need to have either a Labour government or a Labour-Liberal coalition for a second referendum to be possible.
But both within the Labour government and within the Tory government, we've seen an erosion of confidence among MPs within both parties and what that portends in terms of new elections, I don't know that anyone can speculate at this time. Is that correct?
That is reasonably correct. What I would say as well is that one of the things that has changed over the last couple of years is increasing impatience in the European Union's other member states with the process. And there will be a distinct reluctance, I think, among some European Union member states to have the United Kingdom come back into the club, given the political chaos that would likely accompany.
As the chair of the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue, we are scheduled to meet again in Finland in the 1st of November. And I believe this should be a focus of our agenda in terms of discussion. The comments that I've gotten from our European allies, those in the EU, is that their impatience and their frustration just continues to grow. And they're preparing for an EU without the UK. But the impacts on the economies, I think, are going to be greater felt by the United Kingdom than they will be by the European Union. What do you think?
With the exception of Ireland, Ireland is the other country which, unsurprisingly, is going to be directly affected by a Brexit, especially a hard Brexit, because many of the transport and logistic routes through which products reach Ireland effectively go through the United Kingdom. So this was one of the last gasp efforts of the United Kingdom to try and push Ireland, the Republic, to weaken, was effectively to suggest that Ireland would be dragged down in the chaos if it did not agree to significant concessions. But in general, the United Kingdom, the consensus seems to be that it is going to be significantly worse affected than pretty well any other member state in the situation of a hard Brexit.
Yeah, well, my time's expired, but I'm very interested in, obviously, whether or not a Finnish-type resolution to this might be in the asking.
Well,
No,
all right.
it's like trying to predict the future, right?
All right, gentlemen's time
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
has expired. Representative Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sloak, in your written testimony on page 4 under consequences of Brexit, dealing first with the economy, you stated no Brexit deal would create significant economic risks, including the projected loss of 40,000 jobs and an estimated decline in exports to Ireland of 11 to 19%. My question to you is, what impact would an Irish Sea customs border have on Northern Ireland's economy? If you can speak on that.
I don't have a detailed answer on that. This was something that was just agreed between the two sides in the last couple of days, and so there's a lot of economists in the UK and Ireland who are smarter than I am on trade things who are looking into this. I'd be happy to take the question and try and find some analysis on that to provide, but I don't have a good sense off the top of my head. The one thing that I will say is that the risk of a no-deal Brexit would be the most economically disastrous for Ireland in particular, as Dr. Farrell was discussing, as well as for Northern Ireland. And so certainly any sort of negotiated agreement that leads the UK to leave the EU with the deal is going to be less damaging economically than a no-deal scenario would be.
And Dr. Farrell, do you believe that the worst case scenario is a no Brexit deal as far as effect on the economy, and any sort of deal, including an Irish Sea customs border, would not as adversely affect the Irish economy as a no Brexit?
That is entirely correct, sir. So as Dr. Sloat says, we don't have any very good estimates of what the current deal is. But what we can say is that the Northern Ireland business community, while concerned about many of the fuzzy areas and the how easy it is going to be to implement some of the complex arrangements. It is at the stage of talking about details, trying to get the government to commit to specifics, rather than, as with a no-deal Brexit, telling the governments on both sides, and indeed the European Union negotiators as well, that this was potentially going to be disastrous. So I think that we're in a situation where we've moved from a situation of potential dire harm to the economy to messy and painful and difficult to understand regulations, which are probably going to have some significant consequences and may have long-term political consequences in terms of making the island of Ireland into a more robust and more unified economy, but which is not going to be an economic disaster under, I think, any plausible read, that, at least that I have seen, of what is the likely future scenario.
And Dr. Slope, one other thing that you mentioned in your report as talking about, you categorize it as polarized attitudes. It says Brexit has brought back the old polarization, including questions about the region's constitutional future. A September poll by Lord Ashcroft found 51% in favor of joining Ireland, with results divided among community lines. More than half of those surveyed believe Brexit strengthens the case for Irish unification. My question to both of you is, what do you see as the likelihood of Irish unification in the near future?
Part of that, I think, ends up depending on the way Brexit plays out. I think if you had a no-deal Brexit that resulted in a hard border, there probably would be growing support for reunification, due in part to the logistical and the psychological complexities that would be caused by the reimposition of a border. Certainly, all of the talk about the constitutional status, about the border, has unsettled politics there, and so you have discussion about the possibility of having a border poll, a referendum on unification, which is an issue that had been largely quiet for the last 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So I think that question is going to depend in large part on how Brexit plays out. Also, as we have been discussing, there are concerns about this new protocol for Ireland, the imposition of a border in the Irish Sea, and if you end up seeing significant deviation by Great Britain from EU regulations, that is going to end up creating more difference between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It's also possible that that could contribute to a greater call for unification as well.
And Dr. Farrell, do you have anything you'd like to add, or anything that any disagreement that you may have?
So I would say that the likelihood in the next number of years is low. I would also say that there is an important gap between nationalists in Northern Ireland and most parties in the Republic of Ireland. So Sinn Féin very certainly would like to see Irish unification and has a strategy of becoming a political party and a player on both sides of the border. But the Irish government and the major Irish parties are, I think, quite opposed to the idea, although they will not say so publicly, of any Irish reunification in the near future. This is partly because the Republic has always been more ambivalent about unification in private than it has been in public. It has always viewed with some concern the likelihood of importing a new set of political instabilities and problems, and this has been reinforced, if anything, by the Brexit referendum and by looking at the island next door, where you see a constitutional vote that was won by a very narrow majority, which is plunged the United Kingdom into an ongoing political crisis, and I think that the Republic of Ireland has no particular enthusiasm for any similar kinds of votes which would see a United Ireland happening, except with a quite broad degree of assent, including at least passive and grudging assent from the unionist community.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Keating, and thank both of you for being here today. I particularly appreciate you being here. I'm very grateful. I grew up in the most British city of North America, Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm very grateful for that heritage. And then we're also equally grateful for our Irish heritage. The Hibernian Society has always had a remarkable impact on our community. And so we just wish the best somehow for our British and Irish cousins. And I can't wait for you to figure out how to get them back together. And with that in mind, both of you, What aspects of a new U.S.-UK trade deal would be most beneficial to Northern Ireland's economy? What are the principal tenets of a deal that Congress should support in any implementing legislation?
United States. So there is, in a sense, an important trade-off there between U.S. interests in doing a commercial and trade deal with the United Kingdom, and U.S. interests in encouraging continuing peace within Northern Ireland.
I think that's right. I mean, just to take a very specific example, if you take something like genetically modified foods or things within the agriculture industry, those are things that I would presume the U.S. government is going to look for concessions from the British government on in agreeing a free trade agreement with the United States. If the U.K. agrees to make those concessions, it is likely to cause it to deviate from the European Union, and that's going to end up creating more complexities with the situation in Northern Ireland. So it's certainly not to say that the U.S. and UK should not have a free trade agreement. I don't think this should be a zero-sum negotiation. I don't think we should have to pick sides. But I think there is the reality, as Dr. Farrell was just laying out, that the further the UK deviates from EU rules, especially to make free trade agreements with third countries, the more complexity it's going to create in terms of the alignment in Northern Ireland.
I look forward to working with Chairman Keating on any legislation that might be appropriate to be of assistance. And again, for each of you, how can the U.S. increase economic ties with Northern Ireland and support investment opportunities to help mitigate any negative impacts of the no-deal Brexit?
Well, hopefully we won't have a no-deal Brexit, and things at least have been moving in a closer direction to being able to do that. I think if we have a no-deal Brexit, it is going to be very economically disadvantageous for Northern Ireland and potentially is going to be very politically destabilizing and raise some security concerns. I think if there is a Brexit deal, certainly continuing to have American investment in Northern Ireland is going to be incredibly important. In my testimony, I cited a study by Invest Northern Ireland that had counted nearly 900 international companies employing around 100,000 people in Northern Ireland. And so certainly the message from the region in the last couple of years had been that they were open for business. You have an educated population. They speak English. You've had call centers there. You had Game of Thrones and other TV and movie things that were filmed there. So I think there is enormous economic and investment potential in Northern Ireland, and hopefully if we are able to get to a place where Brexit is resolved, we will be able to have continued investment there.
And to add to what Dr. Sloat said, it's clear that the current deal has many complexities, many regulatory complexities, which will make life more complicated in Northern Ireland. But given I think the native Irish ability to figure out an angle on stuff, I would suspect that there are going to be also some interesting opportunities from being the part of the United Kingdom that is directly aligned with the European Union, that may also have some important implications in terms of inward investment and other possible ways to play the rules so as to advantage the local economy.
And I thank you, and I believe indeed the Irish people have overcome many obstacles in the past and can do that in the future. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I thank our witnesses today. I can't think of many days in maybe months, going back months or years, that are more challenging for members than today with everything that's going on in Congress and the House side than today. And I really not only thank the witnesses, but I thank the members of the committee Chairman Engel of the full committee had been working his way here, but it's difficult today. But just as a note of conclusion, which just seems like the wrong word dealing with this subject in any respect, I think the witnesses today and the questions from our members brought forth the idea that there are many contingencies in front of us, many results from that. Some of them are foreseeable. I think many of them are completely unforeseeable because they're so complicated, and the more you bear down, the more that problems will surface. So this won't be the end of the discussion that we have on this. I do think, generally speaking, that from an economic standpoint, the enemy of business is uncertainty, and this is a whole new level of uncertainty, not just for the UK, not just for the EU, but globally as well, and back here. We can see how investments and future trade issues and how financing all can be compromised in an environment of uncertainty. And so I hope that we move forward. I hope that the UK can move forward. I hope the EU can move forward in that respect. There's one thing I am certain about, and that's the fact that despite not having an envoy in place, that this committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, is deeply interested and concerned on this issue. We have a history, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, as a country that I think was vitally involved in the Good Friday Agreement. Our best allies come from UK and the European Union and Ireland. So we have a lot at stake right here in our own country. So we shall hope for the best, keep track, and make sure that our own constituencies, many of them with very strong, as Representative Wilson mentioned, British diaspora, many, like my own, with very strong Irish diaspora, and as members of the committee and myself, having parents and grandparents from Ireland and from Europe as well. So we're deeply invested in this. We clearly want to see progress. The U.S. has much at stake itself. And thanks for taking the time under a very difficult and changing landscape, one that changed by the minute, for being available and really helping us move forward. If this committee, you think, can somehow advance progress in this area, feel free, not just with your statements today, but reaching out to us for anything that you think we can be helpful with. So with that, I'll adjourn the hearing, and thank you all.